Well, after yesterday's shooting at the D.C. Navy Yard, it took no time at all for Democrats and other gun control activists to politicize the tragedy. California Senator Dianne Feinstein put out a statement hours later calling on Congress to, quote, stop shirking its responsibility and resume a thoughtful debate on gun violence in this country. And the Fonz, Henry Winkler of Happy Days fame, sarcastically tweeted, another shooting in Washington, D.C. Please, America, do nothing to promote gun control because that's how we roll until we all shot each other. So, Bob, do you think it was appropriate to do this on the same day that 13 people had been gunned down?
I did, and I will continue to believe that because here's a guy with clearly mental illness. It was documented, the Navy knew about it, and yet he was able to go and purchase a shotgun. Now, what does that tell you?
He listened to Joe Biden's advice, who said go out and buy a shotgun.
Yeah, well, that's, I mean, the idea that in this country you could be a fruitcake like that and go out and buy a gun and then go in and shoot up 13 people. If he wasn't able to buy that gun, and maybe somebody gave him the gun, I don't know.
Don't you think there is a messaging problem a little bit for Biden, though, on that go out and buy a shotgun advice that he was giving during the gun control debate?
I mean, I don't remember much about it, but I suppose you could say that. But I mean, I own a shotgun, but that's not the point. The point is,
you still have to have a background check, though, brother.
Well, did you think this guy had a background check?
If he bought it legally, he did.
Yeah,
the problem is that there was nothing on his background check that said he had a mental illness.
Then that means the background check in the law
background checks are good for finding criminals, felons that want to buy a gun. They'll immediately stop that. That's easy because law enforcement shares information. Problem is if someone is checked into a mental institution in New Jersey and goes and tries to buy a gun in New York, they don't share that information, and no one knows, so they can give him, if he doesn't have a criminal background, you can get a gun. So what needs to happen is you need to beef up that system. If people have mental illness, if there's a history of domestic violence, those types of things, they have to share that information, and they don't do that. But the right isn't complaining about that. The right isn't saying don't do that. You have to understand something. You guys on the left want to point your finger at the right. The right's okay with that. That's fine.
Where were they then during the discussion on the bill that was up there?
The bill wasn't for that. The bill was for a national gun registry. That's what the bill was for.
Oh, I see. And they got a problem with the registering guns, right?
But Bob, that wasn't going. But that wasn't going to change anything regarding mental health reporting and involuntary detention of these people at a mental hospital. If that's where America decides that it wants to go, maybe that's appropriate. But that wasn't what the discussion was on the bill. He did go through a background check, but before, let's say, for example, the shooting that he did through his ceiling to his neighbors.
Right.
She says that she's thought that there was malice in it. That the cops came, they did an investigation. Ultimately, they didn't press charges against him, so there's not a record of it.
Well, there clearly was a record. Somebody found out about it when they were investigating this guy, right?
Later on.
But you have to be convicted of a felony or of domestic violence or some sort of
Why not then take insurance companies keep the records on everybody who uses insurance to go to hospitals or mental hospitals or whatever?
Well, that is why there's but got to be careful with that though as well, because there's a lot of fear that insurance companies keeping the mental health records, now the government getting those records with Obamacare. If I'm sitting in a shrink's office, Greg, and I say something like, I hate my job, I'm a conservative, my boss is really angering me. Well, let's write it down so we make sure she doesn't have...
With insurance companies having that?
Making sure that she can't get a gun. So there is a little bit of fear by putting mental health legislation.
You're okay with insurance companies having that, but the government
I'd like to get Greg in here one second.
Sorry.
Greg, just this week, remember the Chick-fil-A shooter in Washington, D.C.? He's going to be sentenced. It's interesting. You do not hear from the media or from the left any cries about guns or gun control when you have a liberal activist with a backpack trying to gun down, quote, as many people as he could.
Yeah, I mean, if it doesn't fit the storyline, it's not a story. But I think the point when we were starting this discussion was about politicizing an event quickly after it happens. If you think that you have a practical solution that actually solves a problem, you have every right to politicize it. You should say, I know how to fix this. If there was a mass illness and you were a doctor and you knew what was causing that illness, you have every right to say that. The problem with gun control is that the sentiment is emotionally driven and not fact-based. If you, as a person that believes in gun rights and owns a gun, your statistics, Your cold, hard, unfriendly facts actually are right, but they aren't acceptable as an emotional response.
Well,
you have to be emotional about this. The facts, most gun violence has declined. Like you said earlier, 559 victims over 30 years. There have been 330,000 victims from 2000 to 2010 that are gun deaths, not by this. 61% are suicide. This is not a big issue, but the facts are sober and real, and nobody wants them because it's not emotional.
Well, here's a proposal. Do you have a problem with if you've been in a mental institution and you go to try to buy a gun that there's a list of people who've been in mental institutions?
That's already there.
Yeah.
You cannot buy a gun if you've been put into a non-voluntary. Right, but you still can't get it. If you're put in a mental institution in New Jersey and then you go and try to buy a gun in New Jersey, you can't get the gun.
So you go to Pennsylvania, you buy a gun.
It's the information sharing that we need to work on.
Well,
we
fine.
need to have that.
There's a
Can I just
solution.
point something else out, Greg? The left wants to point their fingers at guns. 11,000 guns last year caused murders. 11,000 people died at the hands of gun that wasn't a suicide. 444,000 at cigarettes. Car accidents accounted for about 40,000. Alcohol, 80,000. But they blame the person in every single example with the exception of guns, and now they want to blame the guns.
And I think the left and the Democrats would have more credibility if they spoke up about gun violence in liberal areas like Chicago and started to talk about that, or gun-free zones, for example. I mean, if you look at it, less than 0.1% of the people that were murdered in mass murders over the last 30 years. It's a small fraction, but it's a huge deal, and it's politicized. But look, I'm guilty of it. I called for no more gun-free zones on military installments, so I guess I could be blamed too yesterday for doing the same thing. But I spoke out because that's what I believe.
You think everybody should have had a gun? If they had a gun from home, they should have been able to take it into that facility?
Yes.
There are statistics.
Especially on military installments, yes.
There are statistics of somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million instances where guns are used to protect themselves. That's a fact. If you use these hate facts, these ugly facts, people think you're in poor taste after tragedy. However, they can use emotionally driven arguments that have no basis.
Well, here's a fact. The fact is that the gun advocates say that 2 million people a year use guns to protect themselves. Now, that's just unmitigated bullshit.
Well, you're going to have to talk to President Obama, who commissioned that study last year that found
this is the Florida one.
No, well, there's a new one that President Obama commissioned after Sandy Hook that found up to a couple of million, perhaps between 300,000 and about 2 million people use guns in self-defensive purposes.
And guys, final thoughts. The mayor of Washington, D.C. is blaming this one on the sequester.
Yeah,
which is ridiculous.
Grasping at straws, and also the media, the mainstream media, is not did not come out of this shining like a star at all. And the fact that a lot of people went to bed last night thinking that the shooter had used an AR-15 when there wasn't even an AR-15 on the scene is despicable.
Well, Dianne Feinstein, who used the gun to protect herself years ago, was the first one calling for it. And then Piers Morgan, who has absolutely no idea what he's talking about, perpetuated that.
You always want to say that guns don't kill people, people kill people.
That's right.
And I say people with guns kill people.
Guess what? Us people need to get out of this segment.